Memories lost to trauma lead a wealthy man to a hospital where old photographs reveal a love story time tried to erase. Within medical records and vintage images, past and present collide in unexpected ways. Between amnesia and awakening lies a truth that proves some bonds survive even forgotten years. As recognition dawns, true healing begins. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Julian Thorne awoke to the sterile scent of antiseptic, a stark contrast to the plush linens he vaguely remembered. Panic clawed at his throat. He was in a hospital bed, the crisp white sheets a stark, unfamiliar landscape. His mind was a blank canvas, devoid of even the faintest brushstroke of memory. Fear, cold and suffocating, enveloped him. He tried to sit up, his head throbbing in protest, a wave of nausea washing over him. He felt a strange disconnect, observing his own trembling hands as if they belonged to a stranger. A glimpse of a life opulent, yet strangely hollow, flickered at the edge of his consciousness. A luxurious apartment, a sleek black car, all frustratingly out of reach. He was rich, successful, yet utterly lost. The weight of his amnesia was crushing. He called out weakly, his voice a mere rasp. "Help!" The faint squeak of a nearby door promised arrival, but offered little solace to the vast emptiness within. A nurse, her face etched with practiced kindness, bustled in, her starched uniform whispering against the sterile air. "Mr. Thorne, how are you feeling?" Her voice, though gentle, couldn't quite mask the professional distance. Julian, throat still raw, managed a weak, "Lost." The word hung heavy, mirroring the crushing weight of his amnesia. He stared at his hands, their tremor betraying his inner turmoil. The crisp white sheets felt strangely cold against his skin, a stark contrast to the phantom warmth of a memory just beyond his grasp. The nurse checked his vitals, her touch surprisingly comforting. "We'll get through this," she murmured, her words more a promise to herself than to him. "The doctor will be here soon." The promise felt hollow, a flimsy shield against the encroaching fear. Dr. Evelyn Reed arrived shortly after, her presence a calming balm against the antiseptic chill. Her eyes, the color of warm honey, held a depth that hinted at experiences both joyful and sorrowful. She sat beside him, her manner both professional and empathetic. "Julian," she began softly, her voice a soothing melody. "Tell me what you remember, no matter how small or insignificant it might seem." He tried, truly he did, but his mind remained a locked vault. "Nothing," he whispered, the word catching in his throat. He felt a profound sense of desolation, a vast emptiness echoing within him. He felt a flicker, a whisper of something beautiful, something lost. A melody, perhaps? He closed his eyes, searching for the elusive fragment, but it vanished like smoke in the wind. Evelyn remained patient, her gaze unwavering. "It's all right," she said gently, her hand resting lightly on his. "It takes time. We'll find your memories together." Her empathy, though palpable, felt tinged with a weariness he couldn't quite understand. Perhaps this was the face of burnout, a chilling realization. He wondered about the burden she carried, the weight of other lost souls. She produced a small, worn photo album, its leather cover cracked and faded. "This was found amongst your belongings," she explained, her voice hushed with a hint of curiosity. She opened the album, revealing a younger Julian, laughing, his eyes alight with a joy that seemed both alien and deeply familiar. Beside him was a woman, radiant and beautiful, her laughter mirroring his own. Isabel. The name whispered on his lips, a ghost of recognition, accompanied by a sharp, physical pang of grief. The past, it seemed, was not only lost, but also fiercely guarded. The journey back promised to be arduous and painful. The photograph felt strangely warm in Julian's trembling hands. Isabel's smile, captured in faded sepia, seemed to radiate a warmth that defied the chill of the hospital room. He traced the curve of her cheek, a phantom touch lingering on his fingertips. A wave of dizziness washed over him, the scent of lavender and old books suddenly sharp in his nostrils, a fragrance inexplicably familiar yet impossibly distant. "Do you remember her?" Evelyn's voice, soft as a summer breeze, broke through the swirling haze of his emotions. He looked up, meeting her honey-colored eyes, filled with a mixture of hope and professional detachment that tugged at something deep within him. He swallowed, his throat tight with unshed tears. I don't know, but the feeling, it's like remembering a dream, beautiful and heartbreaking, all at once. He felt a pang of longing so intense it threatened to suffocate him. The emptiness inside him roared like a storm, a stark contrast to the quiet peace Evelyn projected. Evelyn gently turned the page of the album, revealing another photograph. This one showed them laughing, their arms entwined, their eyes sparkling with shared joy. The picture showcased a carefree life, a world away from the sterile white of the hospital. Julian's breath hitched. He saw the reflection of a life lived fully, a love that burned brightly. "There are more photos," Evelyn said, her voice barely a whisper. "But perhaps we should take a break. This is quite intense, isn't it?" Her concern, though genuine, lacked the personal warmth he craved. It was the empathy of a trained professional, not a friend. Julian sensed the weight of her profession, the countless other lives she carried within her, each a burden etched onto her features. A single tear escaped and tracked a path down his cheek, leaving a glistening trail against the crisp white pillowcase. The sterile scent of the room, usually so overwhelming, now seemed insignificant compared to the poignant smell of lavender that persisted. He closed his eyes, and the image of Isabel, her laughter, her touch, the way her eyes crinkled at the corners when she smiled, flooded his mind. A melody, faint and beautiful, played softly in the chambers of his heart. It was a melody he couldn't place, yet it felt profoundly important. The music, the scent, the photograph, these fragments were the keys to a locked door he desperately wanted to open, even if the contents might break him. The scent of antiseptic couldn't entirely mask the lingering aroma of lavender. Julian, eyes still closed, traced the faint melody humming beneath the surface of his consciousness. It was melancholic, beautiful, and utterly heartbreaking. He felt a profound sense of loss, a gaping hole where something precious once resided. Opening his eyes, he saw Evelyn watching him, her expression a careful blend of concern and professional observation. "The music, it keeps playing," he whispered, his voice raspy. "I don't know where it comes from, but it feels important." Evelyn nodded, her gaze softening. "It's a clue, Julian, a fragment of your past trying to reach you." She picked up the photo album, her fingers lingering on a picture of a younger Julian, his arm draped possessively around Isabel. Isabel's eyes sparkled with an uncontainable joy that mirrored a joy Julian felt only as a phantom limb. "She's beautiful," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. The word felt inadequate, a paltry substitute for the tidal wave of feeling threatening to overwhelm him. "She was," Evelyn corrected gently, a subtle shift in her tone, a hint of something akin to sadness creeping into her carefully controlled demeanor. "The photos suggest a very deep connection." Julian reached for the album, his fingers brushing against hers. A jolt, almost electric, passed between them, momentarily breaking the clinical distance. He felt a strange comfort in her touch. He traced the outline of Isabel's face, the image resonating with an aching familiarity. He felt the weight of unseen years, of forgotten laughter and untold stories, pressing down upon him. The sterile hospital room seemed to shrink, the silence punctuated only by the rhythmic beeping of heart monitors and his own ragged breathing. The lavender scent intensified, a persistent reminder of a past both blissful and agonizing. The weight of his amnesia bore down on him, a crushing burden. He longed to remember, to reclaim those lost years, even if it meant confronting pain. The journey back felt daunting, but the faint echo of that melody, that beautiful, heartbreaking music, fueled his resolve. He needed to find his way home, to remember the woman in the photograph and the life they shared. The task felt enormous, impossible even, but he was ready to begin. The following days blurred into a haze of fragmented memories and intense therapy sessions. Evelyn's office, a haven of muted greens and soft lighting, became a sanctuary, a space where Julian wrestled with the ghosts of his past. He learned to identify the triggers, a particular shade of blue, the scent of rain on hot pavement, each sparking a cascade of sensations, both exhilarating and terrifying. Evelyn, initially distant and professional, began to crack. He saw it in the slight tremor in her hand as she offered him a glass of water, in the way her gaze lingered a moment too long on the photo album. The pain, it's like a physical wound, Julian confessed one afternoon, his voice thick with unshed tears. He traced the outline of Isabel's smiling face in a photograph, her laughter echoing in the silence of the room. But it's a wound I can't quite see. Evelyn leaned back, her expression thoughtful. The mind protects itself, Julian. Trauma often hides itself behind amnesia, a self-preservation mechanism. But the body remembers. The emotions remember. She paused, her fingers steepled beneath her chin. The music. Tell me more about the music. He described the melody, its haunting beauty, its underlying sadness, the way it resonated deep within his bones. He felt a strange comfort in sharing this vulnerability, a connection forming between doctor and patient that transcended the clinical boundaries. The antiseptic scent of the hospital, always present, now seemed less sterile, somehow imbued with the faint whisper of lavender, a scent he associated with the photographs, with Isabel. It feels like a lullaby, Julian murmured, closing his eyes. The image of Isabel's face, her radiant smile, flooded his mind, accompanied by a wave of intense longing. The yearning was almost physical, a palpable ache in his chest. The memories, though fragmented and elusive, felt real, alive, infused with a passion he hadn't known existed within him. Evelyn watched him, her heart aching for this broken man, his life a jigsaw puzzle scattered across the floor of his mind. The album lay open between them, a bridge spanning the chasm of his amnesia, a promise of healing and a path back to himself. The weight of his task remained daunting, but he was no longer alone. Evelyn was there with him, walking the road to recovery with him. The scent of antiseptic clung to Julian's clothes, a stark contrast to the faint lavender he now associated with Isabel. He sat across from Evelyn, the worn photo album resting on the polished mahogany table between them. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, a silent ballet mirroring the turmoil within him. The music, it keeps playing in my head, Julian whispered, his voice hoarse. He ran a trembling hand over the album's cover, tracing the faded edges of Isabel's smiling face. The memory, though blurry, felt intensely real, a phantom limb ache in his heart. Evelyn leaned forward, her gaze soft yet penetrating. Tell me about it, Julian. Every detail. He described the melody, a haunting waltz, its bittersweet notes weaving a tapestry of joy and sorrow. He remembered dancing with Isabel, her laughter echoing in his ears, the feel of her hand in his. The memory was a shard of glass, beautiful yet sharp, cutting through the fog of his amnesia. It's familiar, he murmured, his eyes welling. But it's also painful, like a beautiful song playing at a funeral. Evelyn nodded, understanding dawning in her eyes. Grief often manifests in unexpected ways. The music is a key, Julian. It's a pathway to your memories. Days turned into weeks. Each therapy session peeled back another layer of Julian's forgotten past. He began to remember snippets of conversations, fragments of shared dreams, the scent of her perfume, a specific shade of blue that was her favorite. Each revelation brought a wave of both elation and agony. The joy of rediscovering his love for Isabel was bittersweet, tainted by the pervasive shadow of his amnesia. The gap in his memory remained a vast, terrifying abyss. Evelyn, watching his struggle, felt a deep empathy, a feeling that had become increasingly rare in her burnout-ridden life. She saw in him a reflection of her own struggle with emotional numbness. Healing Julian was also a path to healing herself. One evening, as the city lights twinkled outside Evelyn's office window, Julian spoke of a recurring dream, a blurry image of a car, a blinding light, a scream. Fear, raw and primal, gripped him, a chilling premonition of a tragedy he couldn't fully grasp. The weight of his unknown past pressed down on him, threatening to suffocate him. He needed answers not just for himself, but for Isabel, whose memory was becoming as vivid as a painting in his mind. Evelyn held his hand, her touch a silent promise of support, reassuring him that together, they would navigate this painful labyrinth of lost memories. The sterile scent of the hospital room clashed with the lingering fragrance of lavender that haunted Julian's memory. He traced the outline of Isabel's smiling face in the photo album, her eyes sparkling with a joy he desperately wanted to reclaim. A wave of nausea, sharp and sudden, washed over him, leaving him breathless. "The car, the light," he whispered, his voice cracking. The memory, fragmented and terrifying, surfaced like a drowning man gasping for air. He saw flashes of twisting metal, the blinding glare of headlights, a scream that echoed in the abyss of his missing years. Evelyn, sensing his distress, gently placed a hand on his arm. The touch, though hesitant, held a warmth that reached past his emotional barricades. "It's all right, Julian. Breathe. Tell me about it." He squeezed his eyes shut, the image of the accident searing itself into his consciousness. The scent of burning rubber and gasoline suddenly filled his nostrils, a phantom smell from a life he couldn't fully remember. He felt the phantom pressure of a seatbelt across his chest, a suffocating reminder of his vulnerability. I see her," he stammered, his voice thick with unshed tears. "But she's distant, like a ghost." The image of Isabel, superimposed over the mangled wreckage, made his chest ache with a grief he hadn't known he possessed. Evelyn nodded, her expression a mixture of empathy and professional detachment. "Sometimes, fragmented memories are like puzzle pieces. We need to find the others to see the full picture." She paused, her gaze intense. "There's something else I need you to tell me, Julian. What do you feel now?" He looked at her, the question catching him off guard. Fear, a cold hand clutching at his heart, warred with a nascent hope. Fear mostly, but there's something else. A yearning, a desperate need to remember. His gaze fell back to the photograph, the radiant smile of Isabel a beacon in his storm-tossed mind. The lavender scent, stronger now, was a link to a past he desperately needed to embrace. However painful the journey might be, the weight of his amnesia, once a crushing burden, now felt like a challenge, a puzzle begging to be solved. He had to find Isabel. He had to remember. The following morning, sunlight, pale and hesitant, filtered through the hospital curtains, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Julian woke with a start, the lingering scent of antiseptic battling with the persistent ghost of lavender. He reached for the photo album, its worn leather cool against his fingertips. Isabel's face, a radiant smile frozen in time, seemed to beckon him closer. He traced the curve of her cheek, a phantom touch echoing the yearning in his heart. Evelyn entered, her expression a careful blend of concern and encouragement. "Slept well?" she asked, her voice soft. Julian nodded, his throat tight. "I dreamt of a car, a crash." "Tell me about it," Evelyn prompted gently, pulling up a chair. He hesitated, the memory fragmented, terrifying. Twisted metal, bright lights, a scream. He shuddered, the phantom smell of burning rubber filling his nostrils. The image of Isabel, superimposed over the wreckage, brought a fresh wave of nausea. The pain wasn't just in his head. It was a physical ache in his chest, a hollow space where a vital piece of his heart used to be. "It's okay," Evelyn reassured, her voice calm. "It's all right to feel this. It's a process." She paused, observing him. "The important thing is that these fragments are emerging. We're getting closer." He looked at her, searching her face for answers he knew she didn't possess. "Who was she?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Isabel. Who was she to me?" Evelyn's eyes softened. "From the photos, she was someone very important. Someone you loved deeply." She picked up a faded photograph, showing a younger Julian and Isabel laughing on a beach. The vibrant colors seemed to mock the grayness of his present. They show a connection beyond words. A love story, Julian. One that time seems to have tried to erase, but hasn't entirely succeeded. A single tear traced a path down Julian's cheek. It was a tear not just of sadness, but of hope. A fragile bud pushing its way through the frozen ground of his amnesia. He realized, with a sudden clarity, that remembering wasn't just about recovering the past, but about reclaiming his future, a future that desperately needed Isabel in it. He needed to find out what happened to them, to understand the love that time and trauma had attempted to steal. The faint scent of lavender, a comforting presence in his memory, fueled his resolve. He would remember. He had to. The worn photo album lay open on Julian's lap, a testament to a life he couldn't recall. Dust motes danced in the afternoon sunbeams slanting through the hospital window, illuminating the faded images. One photo showed a younger Julian, laughing, his arm around a woman with fiery red hair, Isabel. The joy radiating from the picture was a stark contrast to the emptiness Julian felt. He traced Isabel's laughing face with a trembling fingertip, the paper cool and brittle under his touch. A sharp pang of something longing, grief, pierced the fog of his amnesia. Evelyn watched him, her expression a mixture of empathy and professional detachment. The emotional toll of her work was starting to show. Dark circles underscored her eyes, hinting at sleepless nights spent wrestling with the complexities of the human mind. "It's all right to feel this, Julian," she said softly, her voice a soothing balm against the turmoil within him. "The pain is a sign that something vital is trying to surface." He looked up, his eyes filled with a confusion that bordered on despair. "But what is it? Who was she? Why does looking at her hurt so much?" Evelyn hesitated, choosing her words carefully. The photos suggest a deep and passionate connection, a love that was abruptly ended. She picked up another photograph, this one showing them on a beach, the sea a vibrant turquoise, a stark contrast to the sterile white of the hospital room. "This is what we're trying to rediscover, Julian. Your memories, your life." A single tear escaped his eye, tracing a slow path down his cheek. The scent of lavender, faintly clinging to the album, suddenly overwhelmed him. It was a scent he didn't recognize, yet it felt intimately familiar, a phantom touch from a past he couldn't grasp. It brought a fresh wave of nausea and dizziness, a visceral reaction to a memory just beyond his reach. He closed his eyes, wincing as a fragmented image flashed through his mind. A car, headlights, a scream, then nothing, just darkness. He opened his eyes again, gasping for breath, the chilling echo of the unseen accident clinging to him like a shroud. Evelyn gently placed a comforting hand on his arm, her touch grounding him in the present. "We'll find the answers, Julian," she whispered. Together, the weight of her unspoken promise settled between them, a promise of hope and a recognition of the arduous journey that lay ahead. The sterile scent of antiseptic battled with the lingering perfume of lavender from the album. Julian's breath hitched. The faint floral aroma triggered another fragmented image. A sun-drenched garden, laughter echoing, Isabel's hand in his. The fleeting glimpse vanished as quickly as it arrived, leaving behind a hollow ache. He flinched, clutching the album tighter, its worn leather a comfort against the tremor in his hands. Evelyn watched him, her face etched with concern. The exhaustion in her eyes was palpable. The weight of Julian's amnesia and her own unspoken burdens seemed to press down on her. "The scent, it's bringing something back, isn't it?" she asked softly, her voice a careful balance of encouragement and professional restraint. "Fragments," Julian whispered, his voice hoarse, like shattered pieces of glass. "I see glimpses, but they're gone before I can grasp them." He closed his eyes, the pain etched deep on his face. He felt the familiar wave of nausea building, the phantom taste of metal on his tongue, the memory of the car, the scream. It was there, just out of reach, a haunting melody played on a broken instrument. Evelyn moved closer, her presence a comforting anchor in the storm raging within him. She gently took his hand, her touch firm but gentle. "It's okay to feel this," she reassured him, her voice calming. "It's a sign that your mind is fighting to remember. We'll work through this together." Julian opened his eyes, meeting her gaze. A flicker of hope, fragile yet present, ignited within him. The stark white walls of the hospital room seemed less oppressive now, the sunlight less harsh. He looked back at the photographs, at Isabel's radiant smile, and the weight of his amnesia seemed less crushing. He was not alone. He had Evelyn, and the faint whisper of a past he was determined to reclaim. The journey ahead was daunting, but for the first time since waking up, he felt a tentative sense of optimism. The pain was still there, a constant companion, but it was no longer overwhelming. He could feel the healing beginning. The album lay open, a testament to a life Julian couldn't remember. Dust motes danced in the afternoon sun, slanting through the hospital window, illuminating Isabel's laughing face. Each photograph was a tiny window into a past both tantalizingly close and agonizingly distant. A picnic by a shimmering lake, their faces flushed with laughter and sun. A cozy fireside scene, Julian's arm draped protectively around Isabel's shoulders, her head resting on his chest. The images were vivid, sharp, a stark contrast to the blurry fog of his present. Evelyn, watching him, saw the flicker of something akin to longing in his eyes, a yearning so profound it seemed to physically ache. They feel familiar," he whispered, his voice catching. The words hung in the air, fragile as a butterfly's wing. He turned a page, revealing a picture of them younger still, college students perhaps, their eyes alight with youthful exuberance. This time, the pain hit him harder. A wave of nausea rolled over him. He gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. "Julian," Evelyn said gently, her hand resting reassuringly on his arm. The warmth of her touch seemed to ground him, a lifeline in the churning sea of his memories. "It's all right. Take your time." He swallowed hard, the lump in his throat constricting his breath. "It's like trying to remember a dream," he managed, his voice thick with emotion. "Vivid, intense, but slipping away before I can hold on to it. The feeling is real, but the details, they're gone." He closed the album, the snap echoing in the quiet room, a sharp punctuation to the unspoken emotions swirling between them. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with unspoken questions and the weight of shared sorrow. The scent of lavender lingered faintly, a bittersweet reminder of a past he was desperately trying to reclaim. The journey ahead, both for Julian and Evelyn, was far from over. The fragmented memories were merely the first whispers of a story yet to be fully told. The worn leather of the album felt cool against Julian's trembling fingers. He stared at Isabel's face, a cascade of dark hair framing eyes that held a mischievous glint, a stark contrast to the vacant stare he'd worn for weeks. The scent of old paper and faded ink filled his nostrils, a faint echo of a life he couldn't grasp. A sharp pang, like a physical blow, resonated in his chest. He felt a flicker of something. Was it happiness? Love? Before the memory could solidify, it dissolved, leaving behind only the crushing weight of its absence. Evelyn watched him, her expression a blend of concern and empathy. The sterile white of the hospital room seemed to amplify the intensity of his emotions. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken questions and the raw vulnerability radiating from Julian. He traced the outline of Isabel's face with a shaking finger. Who is she?" he whispered, his voice barely audible above the hum of the hospital machinery. Evelyn hesitated. "She was important to you, Julian. These photos suggest a deep connection." She chose her words carefully, navigating the treacherous terrain of his fractured memory. He flipped another page, revealing a photograph of them on a beach, their laughter etched into their faces, the sun painting the scene in golden hues. He remembered a laugh, but not the specific context. It was frustrating. It felt like a puzzle he'd been given without the pieces. I feel something," he murmured, his eyes welling with tears that silently traced paths down his cheeks. The emotion was overwhelming, a wave of sorrow crashing over him, threatening to pull him under. But it's gone, like sand slipping through my fingers. Evelyn's hand gently covered his. "It's okay to feel lost, Julian," she said softly. "It's okay to grieve what you've lost. We'll find answers. Together." Her voice was a calm anchor in the storm raging within him. The warmth of her touch, a small spark in the chilling void of his amnesia, helped center him slightly. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a raw, desperate hope. The weight of his amnesia, the agonizing distance from his past, was still a vast ocean he had to navigate. But in Evelyn's steady gaze, he saw a life raft, a tiny, hopeful light in the endless darkness. The album, once a trigger for profound pain, now held the promise of a journey, a path back to himself. The first step, he realized, was simply acknowledging the journey itself. The album lay open, revealing Isabel's laughter, vibrant even in the muted tones of the photograph. It was a laughter Julian felt echoing in the hollow spaces of his memory, a phantom limb twitching with a pain both sharp and achingly familiar. The scent of sea salt and sun-baked sand, oddly vivid, clung to the page, a ghostly perfume of a life he'd lost. He traced the curve of her smile with a trembling finger, the worn paper cool beneath his touch. "She was beautiful," he whispered, his voice thick with unshed tears. The words felt inadequate, hollow shells unable to contain the enormity of his loss. Evelyn watched him, her expression a careful blend of empathy and professional detachment. A mask she wore expertly but couldn't quite conceal the weariness behind. Another photograph. Isabel in a sun-drenched garden, her arms laden with sunflowers, her eyes sparkling with an untamed joy. The image triggered a faint memory, a melody, a snatch of a song, light and airy, instantly swallowed by the encroaching darkness. He squeezed his eyes shut, a sob escaping his lips. I remember something," he choked out, the words a fragile whisper against the sterile silence of the room. "But it's just a feeling, like grasping at smoke." Evelyn moved closer, her hand resting gently on his. "It's all right, Julian. Let it come to you. Don't fight it." Her voice, calm and reassuring, was a lifeline in the turbulent sea of his fractured memories. The warmth of her touch, a small island of comfort in an overwhelming ocean of loss, offered a strange solace. He opened his eyes, his gaze lingering on the photographs, each image a fragment of a puzzle he desperately sought to assemble. The weight of his amnesia was a crushing burden, yet within it, a stubborn seed of hope was beginning to sprout. The pictures weren't just images. They were keys, unlocking doors to a past he was slowly, painfully beginning to reclaim. The journey was terrifying, but in Evelyn's presence, he felt a flicker of courage ignite within him, a promise that even in the deepest darkness, healing was possible. He would find Isabel. He would find himself. The muted light of the hospital room cast long shadows across the worn photo album. Julian traced Isabel's face, her youthful glow a stark contrast to the sterile environment. The scent of lilies, a faint reminder of her favorite perfume, hung in the air, a ghost of a memory. A pang of something akin to longing, sharp and unfamiliar, pierced his chest. She's someone important," he breathed, his voice barely a whisper, more to himself than Evelyn. Evelyn sat beside him, her hand resting gently on his arm, a silent offering of support. "The photographs suggest a deep connection, Julian. More than just a friend." He nodded, his gaze lingering on a picture of them laughing on a beach, the sun glinting off the waves. The memory, though elusive, felt like a warm hand brushing his cheek, quickly retreating into the darkness. "I feel a void, a huge, empty space where something vital should be." "That's understandable," Evelyn said softly. "The loss of memory is like losing a limb, a part of yourself. But the feeling, that yearning, that's a sign. It's a pathway back." He closed the album, the weight of it strangely comforting. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with unspoken emotions. He felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him, the effort of trying to remember taking its toll. "I'm tired," he mumbled, his voice thick with fatigue. "Rest, Julian," Evelyn said, her voice gentle. "We'll continue tomorrow. We'll find your answers. I promise you." He leaned back against the pillows, his eyes drifting shut. The images from the album flickered behind his eyelids. Isabel's face a persistent beacon in the swirling fog of his amnesia. The faint melody, the scent of lilies, the feeling of sand between his toes, fragments of a life he desperately longed to reclaim. Sleep offered a temporary escape, but even in his unconsciousness, the yearning remained, a persistent whisper urging him onward, towards a past waiting to be rediscovered. The fear of not finding it, of remaining forever lost, was a cold shadow clinging to him. But Evelyn's promise, a fragile flame, offered a counterpoint, a promise of hope in the encroaching darkness. The next few photographs showed Isabel in various settings, laughing in a sun-drenched garden, her eyes crinkling at the corners, dancing with Julian at what looked like a formal ball, her dress a swirl of shimmering fabric, sitting on a park bench, hand in hand, their heads close together in whispered conversation. Each image was a tiny window into a world Julian desperately wanted to remember, a world where joy and intimacy reigned. The sheer volume of shared happiness was overwhelming, a stark contrast to the sterile emptiness of his current reality. He felt a tremor run through him, a wave of profound sadness washing over him. It wasn't just the loss of memory, it was the loss of her. He didn't know who she was, but the aching void in his heart screamed that she was essential, a missing piece of his very being. "Isabel," he whispered, the name tasting unfamiliar yet somehow deeply resonant on his tongue. The sound of it felt like a forgotten melody, beautiful and heartbreaking all at once. Evelyn watched him, her expression a mixture of concern and empathy. "She seems incredibly important to you, Julian." He nodded, unable to articulate the complex emotions swirling within him. He felt a desperate longing for connection, a yearning to bridge the chasm of forgotten years. The photos were more than just images. They were echoes of a life lived, a love shared, a happiness he now only glimpsed through a blurry, fragmented lens. He turned another page. This photo was different. It depicted a stormy sky, dark clouds mirroring the heavy feeling descending upon him. Isabel was still there, but her face held a trace of worry. Julian's face, partially obscured by shadow, seemed tense, almost angry. An unsettling tension emanated from the image. The laughter and joy were gone, replaced by a palpable sense of unease. The vibrant colors of the previous pictures had faded, replaced by a muted palette that reflected the emotional shift. The subtle change in the atmosphere of the photograph hinted at the turning point, the crack in the foundation of their idyllic life. A cold dread crept into Julian's heart. He felt a chilling premonition, a sense that something terrible had happened. He closed the album, a profound sense of loss and foreboding settling upon him, and the weight of the unknown pressed heavily on his chest. The comforting warmth of a memory replaced by a bitter frost of fear. The air in the room grew thick with unspoken questions, heavy with the weight of Julian's unspoken fears. He stared at the photo album, its worn leather cover a tactile testament to a life lived, a life he couldn't remember. The scent of old paper and faded ink filled his senses, a ghostly perfume of the past. He flipped to another page, his fingers tracing the edges of the photographs, each touch sending a faint electric shock through him. Isabel's laughter echoed in his mind, a sound both familiar and foreign. He saw her in a series of snapshots, a young woman with bright, intelligent eyes and a radiant smile, her hand resting lovingly on his arm. He saw them hiking in a misty forest, her hair whipping in the wind, dancing at a lively party, her laughter bright against the backdrop of swirling light, sharing a quiet moment on a beach at sunset, her head resting on his shoulder, the warmth of the sun on their skin almost palpable. "She was happy," he whispered, his voice barely audible, a tremor in his tone reflecting the growing unease within him. Evelyn watched him, her heart aching for the man who sat before her, lost in the echoes of a life he couldn't grasp. "Yes, Julian," she said softly, her voice a gentle hand reaching out across the chasm of his amnesia. She seems to have been very happy with you. He closed the album, the images imprinted on his mind, a kaleidoscope of joy and sorrow. The vibrant colors seemed to fade as he reached for a tissue, wiping away a single tear that escaped, betraying the well of emotions he struggled to contain. The weight of his forgotten past pressed down on him, crushing him beneath the weight of his lost memories. "It hurts," he breathed, the words raw with emotion. This yearning, it's unbearable." Evelyn nodded understandingly. She knew the pain of loss, of a past buried deep, though its nature remained different from Julian's. The empathy she felt was as palpable as the silence that followed, a silent testament to the shared burden of their unspoken emotions. The photo album wasn't just a collection of images. It was a map, a cryptic guide leading him back to himself, to a life he desperately needed to reclaim. The journey would be fraught with pain, but he knew, with a certainty that resonated deep within his soul, that it was a journey he must undertake. He had to find Isabel, find his past, find himself. The album sat closed, but the story it told was only beginning. Evelyn gently placed a hand on Julian's arm, the warmth a small comfort against the chill of his despair. The scent of antiseptic still clung to the air, a stark contrast to the faded perfume of the old photographs. "The album is just the beginning, Julian," she said softly, her voice a balm to his raw emotions. "We need to look at your medical records, see if there are any clues, anything that might trigger further memories." He nodded, his gaze fixed on the closed album, a tangible representation of his fragmented past. The crisp white pages of his medical charts felt oddly alien in his trembling hands. A series of dates, diagnoses, and clinical notes swam before his eyes, meaningless symbols marking a life he couldn't comprehend. Then, a name, Isabel Moreau. The name resonated, a familiar melody playing softly in the quiet chambers of his lost memories, stirring a phantom ache in his chest. "Isabel?" he whispered, the name catching on a sigh. A sudden rush of images, a sun-drenched beach, the feel of soft sand between his toes, the sound of her laughter, light as seafoam, flooded his senses. Then, just as abruptly, the images retreated, leaving behind only a gnawing emptiness and a profound sense of loss. He felt the rising tide of panic, threatening to overwhelm him. Evelyn's hand tightened on his arm, a grounding presence in the swirling vortex of his emotions. "Breathe, Julian," she instructed gently, her voice calm and steady. "It's okay. We'll take it slowly. We'll find her." He closed his eyes, taking several deep, shuddering breaths, the scent of lavender from the hand cream she often used subtly calming his frayed nerves. The faint rhythm of her heartbeat, a quiet counterpoint to the frantic drumming in his chest, offered a lifeline in the storm. He opened his eyes, meeting her gaze. A silent promise passed between them, a shared commitment to unravel the tangled threads of his past. A journey that promised both pain and the possibility of healing. The medical records lay forgotten, their clinical details suddenly insignificant compared to the overwhelming urgency to find Isabel, to piece back together the shattered fragments of his life. Circumstance. It spoke of shared dreams, whispered promises under starlit skies, the quiet intimacy of stolen moments. Then, the tone shifted. A shadow fell across the page, a chilling undercurrent of fear. The words became cryptic, allusions to a looming danger, a threat that forced them apart. "They know," she wrote, the words underlined twice. "They're watching. I can't risk you." Julian's hands shook, the paper rustling like dried leaves. He reread the final sentence, a chilling plea. "Find the hummingbird. It will lead you to the truth." He looked up at Evelyn, his eyes wide, reflecting the confusion and rising terror. The they felt like a tangible presence in the room, an unseen menace closing in. Evelyn, sensing his distress, gently reached for his hand. Her touch was a grounding force, a lifeline in the maelstrom of his emotions. "The hummingbird, what could it mean?" she asked softly, her voice a calming balm against the storm raging inside him. Julian shook his head, his gaze fixed on the letter. I don't know, but I have a feeling it's more than just a metaphor. This is a clue, a way to understand what happened, to find Isabel. A spark of determination ignited in his eyes, a flicker of defiance against the suffocating darkness of his amnesia. He clenched the letter, his knuckles white, a silent vow forming in his heart. He would find the hummingbird. He would find Isabel. He would find the truth. The scent of lilies, sharp and sweet, hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the sterile smell of antiseptic that usually clung to the hospital room. Julian traced the faded ink of Isabel's letter again, the paper fragile beneath his touch. He felt the weight of her fear, the chilling urgency in her words. The hummingbird, a symbol, a clue, a lifeline to a past he desperately wanted to reclaim. Evelyn watched him, her heart aching for the man unraveling before her. His normally composed demeanor was shattered, replaced by a raw vulnerability that both captivated and terrified her. The symbolism, she began, choosing her words carefully. It could be anything, a place, a person, a memory triggered by a specific image. Julian shook his head, a tremor running through him. No, he whispered, his voice barely audible. It feels personal, like a secret code, something only we would understand. He paused, his eyes distant, lost in the labyrinth of his forgotten memories. Isabel was always drawn to nature, to small, delicate things. Hummingbirds. They're quick, elusive, almost magical. The weight of unspoken years pressed down on them. The room felt smaller, the silence heavy with the unspoken words hanging between them. Evelyn's hand instinctively reached out, covering his. His flinch was barely perceptible, yet it spoke volumes. The trust so carefully built felt fragile, threatened by the depth of his trauma. "We'll find it, Julian," Evelyn said, her voice a soft reassurance against the storm brewing inside him. "We'll find the hummingbird, and we'll find the truth." Her words, simple yet powerful, offered a beacon of hope in the encroaching darkness. The weight of his past, the mystery of the hummingbird, the urgency to find Isabel, it all coalesced into a burning determination in Julian's eyes. He nodded, a single, resolute movement that spoke volumes. The search had begun. The mahogany safe, a relic of a life Julian barely remembered, stood imposing in the corner. The heavy door, resisting his trembling touch, finally swung open, revealing not just a compartment, but a hidden recess lined with faded velvet. Inside, nestled amongst yellowed papers, lay a small, tarnished silver box. Evelyn watched, her breath catching in her throat as Julian delicately lifted the box. The scent of old paper and dried roses wafted up, a ghostly perfume of a forgotten time. He opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded silk, was a single letter, tied with a ribbon of dried lavender. The paper was brittle, the ink faded, yet the elegant script hinted at a passionate heart. As Julian unfolded the letter, a photograph slipped out, depicting a younger, laughing Isabel, her eyes sparkling with an untamed joy. "Isabel," he whispered, his voice a mere breath. The photograph felt warm in his hand, a tangible connection to a past he desperately sought. Evelyn could feel the raw emotion radiating from him, a palpable wave of yearning and pain. Evelyn gently took the letter, reading it aloud, her voice carefully measured. "My dearest Julian, if you find this, know that I fought until the very end. Their shadows stretch long, my love, but I've protected you. Remember the hummingbird. It will guide you. This truth is too dangerous for them to find, and my life must be kept silent until the right time. Wait, find me. Trust yourself. Isabel." Silence hung heavy in the air, broken only by Julian's ragged breathing. The hummingbird, a cryptic message, a symbol of hope in the face of overwhelming despair. The letter hinted at a conspiracy, a powerful enemy that had driven a wedge between them, threatening not only their love but their very lives. The image of Isabel's defiant smile, captured in the photograph, offered a flicker of reassurance against the encroaching darkness. A threat? Julian murmured, his voice tight with a newfound understanding. Someone powerful enough to erase us. He looked at Evelyn, his eyes reflecting the storm raging within. Fear warred with a fierce determination. He had to find the answers. He had to find Isabel. He had to find the hummingbird. The scent of lavender, faint but persistent, clung to the brittle paper. Julian traced Isabel's elegant script, each word a whisper from a lost life. Evelyn watched him, her heart aching with a mixture of empathy and professional detachment. The sterile hospital room felt suddenly inadequate, dwarfed by the weight of their discovery. Their shadows stretched long. Evelyn read aloud, her voice catching on the finality of the words. The phrase hung in the air, heavy with unspoken threat. Julian's hand trembled, his knuckles bone-white against the aged paper. "Who were they?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, a fragile thread in the suffocating silence. The question hung between them, a chasm of uncertainty. Evelyn shook her head slowly. "The letter doesn't say, but it suggests a powerful enemy, someone who wanted to silence you both." She gestured to the photograph, Isabel's radiant smile a stark contrast to the chilling message. "The hummingbird, it's a symbol, Julian. A clue." He stared at the image, a familiar ache blooming in his chest. The faintest glimmer of a memory flickered. A hummingbird, wings a blur of iridescent green, hovering near a window, a seaside cottage. The image was fragmented, blurry, yet intensely evocative. "A cottage," he murmured, the word a fragile tendril reaching towards the lost past. "By the sea. I remember a cottage." A wave of dizziness washed over him. The memory, elusive as smoke, threatened to slip away again. Evelyn quickly offered him a glass of water, her touch gentle, reassuring. "We'll find it, Julian," she said, her voice firm, offering a lifeline in the swirling chaos of his fragmented memories. "We'll find the hummingbird, and we'll find the answers." The weight of his past, the threat lurking in the shadows, suddenly felt less insurmountable. Hope, fragile but persistent, took root. The letter, a cryptic message from a lost love, had ignited a spark. The search for Isabel was no longer just a quest for memory. It was a fight for their future. The journey promised to be long and perilous, but for the first time since waking up in that sterile hospital room, Julian felt a stirring of purpose, a determination to confront the darkness and reclaim his life. The salty tang of sea air filled Julian's lungs, a stark contrast to the sterile hospital scent. The cottage, nestled amongst wind-whipped dunes, looked exactly as it did in the photograph, weathered shingles, a rambling rose bush clinging to the porch. A wave of dizziness threatened to pull him under, the memory of Isabel's laughter echoing faintly in the wind's mournful sigh. It's like stepping into a dream," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Evelyn, ever watchful, placed a comforting hand on his arm. "It's a memory, Julian. A painful one, perhaps, but a memory nonetheless." The cottage felt both familiar and alien, a tangible link to a past he couldn't fully grasp. He ran a trembling hand over the rough-hewn wood of the porch railing, each grain a silent witness to forgotten moments. The interior was equally evocative. The scent of lavender, faint yet persistent, hung in the air. Sunlight streamed through dusty windows, illuminating faded floral wallpaper and a chipped teacup on a scarred table. It was as though time had paused, preserving a life abruptly cut short. "Isabel, she was here," he breathed, his eyes scanning the room, searching for traces of her presence. A tear escaped, tracing a path through the dust on his cheek. "Yes," Evelyn said softly, her voice barely audible above the rhythmic crashing of waves. "She was here, and something happened here. Something that erased years from your life." The weight of her words settled heavily on Julian, the reality of his fragmented past pressing in on him. He felt a profound sense of loss, a gaping hole where precious memories should be. He needed to fill that void, to understand what had happened, not just for himself, but for Isabel. The hummingbird, the elusive symbol, seemed to flutter at the edge of his consciousness. a tantalizing whisper of the truth. He felt a surge of resolve, a determination to piece together the fractured fragments of his life, no matter how painful the journey. The search for answers had begun in earnest. The city street, bustling with midday energy, felt alien yet familiar. The scent of exhaust fumes and roasting chestnuts clashed jarringly with the lavender-laced memories of the cottage. Julian shivered, pulling his coat tighter. "This is where I used to work," he mumbled, pointing to a now modernized office building. Its sleek glass facade a stark contrast to the faded photograph in his hand. The image showed a smaller, less imposing structure, a place that held echoes of laughter and ambition. Evelyn watched him, her heart aching for his struggle. "It must be difficult," she offered gently, her voice barely a whisper against the city's clamor. He nodded, his gaze fixed on the building. "Difficult doesn't begin to cover it. It's like trying to remember a dream you know you had, but the details keep slipping away." The frustration was evident in his voice, a tremor betraying the emotional toll. They crossed the street, the blare of horns a harsh counterpoint to the quiet intensity between them. He stopped abruptly, his eyes wide, fixated on a small, unassuming cafe across the road. "That cafe," he breathed, his voice laced with a fragile hope. "Isabel, we used to come here." The cafe was quaint, its windows displaying a tempting array of pastries. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee and warm bread wafted across the street, a bittersweet reminder of shared moments. Julian's breath hitched. A fleeting image, a shared laugh. The warmth of Isabel's hand flickered in his mind before vanishing like smoke. The pain of the lost memory was almost physical. Evelyn gently squeezed his arm. "It's okay, Julian. Take your time. Let the memories come to you." He took a deep breath, the scent of coffee momentarily grounding him. The city's noise faded into a muted background hum. He was no longer just observing the surroundings. He was feeling them, reconnecting with fragments of his past. It was a fragile connection, easily broken. Yet he was determined to hold on to it, to unravel the mysteries buried beneath the surface of his amnesia. The journey was far from over, but with every recovered memory, with every rediscovered location, a sliver of hope pierced the darkness. He felt closer to Isabel, closer to the man he once was, closer to the truth. The seaside cottage stood weathered and gray, a stark contrast to the vibrant image in Julian's hand. Salt-laced wind whipped around them, carrying the scent of brine and distant fish. The photograph showed a younger, laughing Julian, his arm draped around Isabel, her hair bright against the azure sky. The scene was idyllic, a painful juxtaposition to the present. "It's smaller than I remember," Julian whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind's mournful cry. He traced the outline of Isabel's face in the photo, a familiar ache blooming in his chest. Evelyn watched him, her empathy a tangible presence. "The sea changes things, Julian. Time too." She placed a comforting hand on his arm, the gesture both professional and deeply human. The touch seemed to ground him. He nodded, his gaze lingering on the cottage's decaying porch. A half-remembered melody drifted through his mind, a tune played on a battered old piano within these very walls. The melody, sweet and sad, tugged at something deep within him, a feeling both beautiful and devastating. He felt a wave of dizziness, the overwhelming weight of forgotten years pressing down on him. I feel something," he stammered, his voice laced with fear and wonder. His hand trembled as he clutched the photo tighter. The image, once a trigger for pain, now felt like a lifeline, a fragile thread connecting him to a lost past. Evelyn knelt beside him, her eyes mirroring his apprehension. "Let it come, Julian. Don't fight it." He closed his eyes, inhaling deeply the sharp, salty tang of the air, the sound of crashing waves, the distant cry of gulls, a lingering scent of wood smoke and lavender. Fragments of memory coalesced, forming a fleeting, fragmented vision of a bonfire on the beach, laughter echoing through the night, the warmth of Isabel's hand in his. A sharp intake of breath escaped his lips, the vision dissolving as quickly as it appeared, leaving him breathless and trembling. He opened his eyes, the tears welling up, reflecting the turbulent sea before him. The pain was intense, yet it was accompanied by a stirring of hope. He wasn't just retrieving memories. He was reclaiming a part of himself. This wasn't simply an investigation. It was a rebirth. The journey to find Isabel was now inseparable from the journey to rediscover who he was. The cottage, battered and worn, stood as a testament to the enduring power of time and the enduring strength of forgotten love. The bustling city street, a blur of yellow cabs and hurried pedestrians in the photograph, felt eerily different now. A chill wind, carrying the scent of exhaust fumes and hot dogs, whipped around Julian as he stood before the now modernized building, its original facade barely recognizable. The restaurant depicted in the photo, a quaint bistro, had been replaced by a sleek, glass-fronted corporate edifice. "It's gone," he whispered, a tremor in his voice. The image in his hand, capturing a stolen kiss amidst the clamor of the city, felt like a ghost from a vanished era. Evelyn, ever observant, placed a hand on his arm. "The city changes, Julian, but the feelings, those remain." Her voice was soft, laced with understanding. He looked at her, her eyes reflecting the city lights, a silent empathy passing between them. He felt the familiar stab of loss, but this time, it wasn't purely debilitating. There was a spark of determination amidst the pain. They moved on to a quiet, tree-lined street, the location of a small music shop. The building stood almost unchanged, its weathered wooden facade hinting at a history spanning decades. The faint strains of a familiar melody, a melancholic piano piece, drifted from within. Julian's breath hitched. He recognized the tune, a song he'd played countless times with Isabel. This wasn't just a location. It was a key to unlocking a hidden room in his heart. He hesitated at the threshold. I can't," he mumbled, his hand trembling. The memory of playing that song, hand in hand with Isabel, was just at the edge of his awareness, and the fear of the pain it might bring stopped him. Evelyn gently encouraged him forward. "Go in, Julian. It's okay to feel the pain. Let it guide you." Her words were balm to his bruised soul. Stepping inside, the aroma of aged wood and polished brass filled his senses. He saw a dusty old piano in the corner, a battered instrument that seemed to whisper of forgotten melodies and shared laughter. A faint, floral scent hung in the air, lavender, the same scent that had haunted his dreams. Suddenly, the music stopped. An elderly woman with kind eyes and silver hair approached. Her voice, raspy from years, seemed to hold the secrets of the past. "You must be looking for something lost," she said, her gaze filled with a profound understanding. Julian's heart pounded. He knew somehow that she held a piece of his missing puzzle. The weight of his past, and the potential for future discovery, hung heavy in the air, thick and suffocating. He knew this was just the beginning of a long and difficult journey, but the fear was overshadowed by a powerful hope. He had to find Isabel. He had to. The woman, her name was Mrs. Albright, according to a faded nameplate on her desk, studied Julian with shrewd eyes. The scent of old paper and pipe tobacco clung to her like a second skin. "Isabel, that name rings a bell," she murmured, her voice a low croon. "Beautiful woman, fiery spirit." She tapped a gnarled finger against a dusty ledger. "Let me see, Thorne, Julian Thorne. Yes, I remember him, a regular here. He always bought her lavender." Julian felt a jolt, a phantom touch of lavender on his skin, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. "Lavender," he whispered, the word tasting like ash and bittersweet memory. Evelyn watched him, her expression a mixture of hope and concern. Mrs. Albright's gaze drifted to a framed photograph tucked behind the ledger. A younger Julian, his hair darker, a mischievous glint in his eyes, stood beside a vibrant Isabel, her laughter echoing silently in the still air. The photo was taken in this very shop. "They were inseparable," Mrs. Albright said softly, her voice heavy with unspoken knowledge. "But then things changed. A shadow fell over them. He stopped coming. She sold the shop, heartbroken. Then, she disappeared. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with unspoken grief. Julian felt a knot tightening in his chest, a visceral ache of loss so profound it stole his breath. The music, that haunting melody, played faintly in the background, a melancholic soundtrack to his forgotten love story. Evelyn moved closer, her hand resting gently on his arm. "Mrs. Albright," she said, her voice calm and measured, "do you know anything about a business rival? Someone who might have wanted to harm Julian or Isabel?" The old woman's eyes narrowed. "There were whispers," she admitted, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush. "A man named Marcus Thorne, Julian's cousin. Envious of his success, they said. Ruthless. He had a reputation for making enemies disappear." A chill ran down Julian's spine. Marcus Thorne. The name felt familiar, a venomous serpent slithering into his subconscious. He felt a surge of anger, hot and sharp, rising within him, cutting through the fog of amnesia. The pieces were starting to fit together. The threat, the betrayal, the loss. It wasn't an accident. It was deliberate, and the trail led to his own family. He stood, his legs unsteady, the weight of the past bearing down on him. But alongside the fear and grief, there was a flicker of resolve. He would find Isabel. He would confront Marcus. He would uncover the truth no matter the cost. The journey ahead would be harrowing, but he was no longer lost. He was found, and he was ready to fight. The seaside cottage, battered by wind and time, stood as a skeletal reminder of happier days. Salt spray kissed Julian's face as he stepped onto the creaking porch. The scent of brine and decaying would heavy in the air. Evelyn, ever watchful, stayed close, her presence a comforting anchor in the swirling vortex of his resurfacing memories. The cottage's interior was a ghostly echo of a life lived, dust motes dancing in the weak sunlight filtering through grimy windows. A faded floral wallpaper peeled at the edges, mirroring the fragile state of Julian's own memories. "Isabel," he whispered, the name a fragile breath on the wind. He ran a hand over a chipped paint surface on a small table, his touch lingering. He saw her, a ghost of a vision in his mind's eye. Isabel laughing, her hair catching the sunlight, her eyes sparkling with an uncontainable joy. The image shattered, replaced by a jarring flash of a splintered windshield. The screams. Evelyn's hand found his, a silent acknowledgement of the pain. "It's all right, Julian," she murmured, her voice a soft counterpoint to the mournful cry of gulls overhead. "We'll find answers. We'll find peace." He nodded, the gesture stiff, his throat choked with unshed tears. The cottage held its secrets close, whispering them to the wind. He needed more than whispers. He needed undeniable proof. He saw a small, worn music box on a dusty shelf. A familiar melody began to play, soft and haunting. It was the same melody he'd heard in Mrs. Albright's shop, a bittersweet lullaby of their lost love. Tears welled in his eyes, hot and heavy. Leaving the cottage, a profound sense of loss settled over Julian, a weight heavier than the salty air. The silence in the car was broken only by the rhythmic thump of the tires on the road and Evelyn's quiet presence. He squeezed her hand, his gratitude unspoken yet powerful. The journey was far from over. The truth, like a phantom limb, ached with its absence, yet promised a healing he desperately craved. The road ahead remained uncertain, but the path at last was clearer. The pieces, once scattered fragments of a shattered life, were slowly, painstakingly being put back together, one painful, precious memory at a time. The city street, a blur of hurried footsteps and honking taxis, felt alien yet familiar. Julian clutched the faded photograph, Isabel, radiant in a red dress, laughing against the backdrop of a now derelict Italian restaurant. The scent of aged pasta sauce and simmering tomatoes, a phantom aroma from a past life, hung faintly in the air, a bittersweet ghost of happiness. "This place?" Julian breathed, his voice barely a whisper. The memory of a shared meal, a stolen kiss, flickering in his mind's eye. Evelyn, sensing his fragile state, gently squeezed his hand. "It's okay, Julian. Take your time." The restaurant, reborn as a trendy tapas bar, held no trace of its former self. Yet, the building's essence still resonated with the echoes of their love. Inside, the muted chatter felt invasive, a harsh contrast to the intimate memories Julian was struggling to recall. He ordered a glass of wine, the crimson liquid mirroring the dress in the photograph, a visual reminder of the woman he couldn't fully remember, yet deeply mourned. He saw, or rather felt, a shadow of a figure in the doorway, a man's silhouette, tall and imposing, with an aura of menace. The same man from the blurry photo in the album. "There," Julian whispered, pointing a trembling finger. "That man. He was there." Evelyn studied the figure. It seemed impossible to read him. His face was shrouded in shadow. He lingered, before disappearing into the city's swirling currents of people. "He was watching us," Julian insisted, his voice laced with a growing unease. The phantom scent of danger replaced the aroma of tomatoes. The familiar weight of fear returned, squeezing Julian's chest. He knows something." Evelyn nodded grimly. "We need to be cautious, Julian. This is more than just finding lost memories. It's about confronting a present danger." The fear in her eyes echoed his own, and for the first time, Julian saw in her a reflection of his own trauma, a shared understanding that transcended the doctor-patient relationship. The path to healing wasn't merely about recalling the past, but about protecting the future. The city lights, once a beautiful backdrop to their love, now felt menacing. A subtle shift in the air, a change in the rhythm of the city itself, underscored their danger. They left the tapas bar, the chilling presence of the unknown man clinging to them like a shadow. The air hung thick with the scent of stale coffee and desperation. Evelyn's office, usually a sanctuary of calm, felt claustrophobic. Julian stared at the blurry photo, his knuckles white around the frame. The man in the shadow, a silhouette against the vibrant chaos of the city street, remained unnervingly familiar. "He knows?" Julian repeated, his voice raw with a fear that went beyond the amnesia. "He knows about Isabel." Evelyn's expression was a careful blend of concern and steely resolve. She leaned forward, her gaze unwavering. "We need to identify him, Julian. His presence isn't coincidental. This isn't just about your past. It's about protecting your future and possibly Isabel's." The weight of that statement settled heavily between them. The unspoken fear, the shared understanding of the danger, created an unspoken bond. Julian saw the exhaustion etched beneath Evelyn's professional composure, the empathy burnout she'd confided in him about, now fueled by this new threat. He pushed the photo across the desk, his gaze meeting Evelyn's. "He's connected to everything. The accident, Isabel's disappearance." A tremor ran through him, a physical manifestation of the fear gripping his soul. Evelyn picked up the phone, her movements deliberate, a counterpoint to the storm raging within Julian. "We'll start with the restaurant. We need to see if anyone recognizes him. We need to understand why he was there." The next few hours were a blur of interviews, hushed conversations, and frantic searches through old city directories. Each lead proved frustratingly thin, each dead end adding to the mounting tension. The once familiar city now felt like a labyrinth of shadows, the friendly faces replaced by suspicious glances. The vibrant tapestry of city life had become a dangerous game of cat and mouse. Evening fell, casting long shadows across their faces, mirroring the encroaching darkness of their situation. The city lights, once romantic, now seemed to wink with malicious intent. The fear Julian had felt at the restaurant intensified, amplified by the relentless pursuit of the unknown. The journey to reclaim his past had become a race against an unseen enemy, a relentless pursuit that tested the boundaries of their resilience. The restaurant, Le Fleur, was a ghost of its former self. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of afternoon sun, slicing through the grimy window. Julian ran a trembling hand along the worn mahogany bar, the grain cool beneath his touch. The scent of decay, old wood, stagnant air, and a faint, lingering perfume, clung to the space like a shroud. Evelyn stood beside him, her silence a comforting presence in the oppressive quiet. "It's different," Julian whispered, his voice barely audible above the rhythmic tick of a grandfather clock in the corner. He remembered laughter echoing here, the clinking of glasses, the warm glow of candlelight. Now only emptiness remained, a hollow shell mirroring the cavern in his own memory. Evelyn placed a hand on his arm, a gesture both supportive and professional. "The photos don't lie, Julian. This place was important. Let's see if we can find someone who remembers." A sudden noise, a shuffling behind a heavy velvet curtain that concealed a back room, startled them both. Julian's breath hitched. He felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the primal fear that had haunted him since his awakening. He glanced at Evelyn, seeing a flicker of apprehension in her eyes. Cautiously, they approached the curtain. A frail, elderly woman emerged, her face etched with the passage of time, her eyes filled with a mixture of surprise and weariness. Her name was Madame Dubois, the restaurant's former owner. "Le Fleur, it's been a long time," she said, her voice raspy, each word laced with the weight of forgotten years. Her gaze fell on Julian, her eyes widening slightly. You remind me of someone." The memory, fractured and incomplete, flickered in Julian's mind. A younger man, vibrant, laughing, Isabel. The pain, sharp and sudden, threatened to overwhelm him. He clenched his jaw, fighting back tears. "Do you remember a man about my age? With a woman, Isabel?" Julian managed to ask, his voice thick with emotion. Madame Dubois's gaze drifted to a faded photograph tucked behind the bar, a picture of the restaurant in its heyday. Julian and Isabel stood smiling brightly near a table, their happiness palpable even through the faded colors. "Isabel?" the old woman murmured, a tremor running through her frail frame. "A beautiful woman. And him, so full of life." She paused, her gaze hardening. "Then, there was trouble. A man, dark, threatening. He came here often. Argued with him. The man you remind me of." She looked at Julian, her eyes reflecting a sorrowful understanding. "The man, he caused all the trouble. He made them both disappear." The revelation hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The shadowy figure from the photograph, the man who Julian knew was connected to everything, had a name, a face, and a motive. The pieces were falling into place, yet the full picture remained elusive, leaving Julian with a gnawing sense of dread and an even greater determination to uncover the truth. The weight of the past pressed down on him, threatening to bury him beneath its crushing weight. But this time he knew he wouldn't let it happen. He would fight for his memories, for Isabel, for his future. The seaside cottage, nestled amongst windswept dunes, was a ruin. Salt-laced air whipped through broken windows, carrying the mournful cry of gulls. Julian felt a visceral chill, deeper than the autumn wind. He'd seen this place in photographs, a haven of laughter and love, now a skeletal echo of its former self. Evelyn watched him, her expression a mixture of concern and understanding. "It's hard," he finally whispered, his voice cracking. The once vibrant colors of the photos were dulled, replaced by the muted grays and browns of decay. He touched a crumbling stone wall, the rough texture a stark contrast to the smooth, polished surfaces of his current life. The scent of sea and brine was sharp, but under it, a fainter fragrance, something floral and sweet, clung to the air, a ghost of Isabel's perfume. A wave of grief, sharp and unexpected, washed over him. He stumbled, his hand flying to his chest, his breathing ragged. Evelyn rushed to his side, her hand a reassuring weight on his arm. "Julian, breathe," she said softly, her voice calm amidst the howling wind. "It's okay to feel this pain. It's part of the healing." He looked at her, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. The strength she showed him, her quiet empathy, was a lifeline in this storm of emotions. I don't understand," he choked out. "Why? Why would anyone do this?" Evelyn's gaze was steady, We'll find out, Julian. We'll uncover the truth, piece by piece. But for now, let's just be here, in this place that held so much joy and so much pain. She gently guided him towards a weathered bench overlooking the turbulent sea. The waves crashed against the shore, mirroring the turmoil within him. He sat, his head bowed, the weight of forgotten years pressing down on his shoulders. The wind carried the scent of the sea and the faint, lingering memory of a love lost, a love he was desperately trying to reclaim. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, that the answers he sought lay buried beneath the wreckage of his past, waiting to be unearthed. The journey wouldn't be easy, but with Evelyn by his side, he was ready to face it. The restaurant, Le Fleur, was a ghost of its former self. Dust motes danced in the weak sunlight filtering through grimy windows. Julian stared at a faded photograph himself and Isabel, laughing, their faces illuminated by candlelight. The memory, however faint, was agonizingly beautiful. He felt the phantom weight of her hand in his, the warmth of her smile against his cheek. "It's different," he murmured, his voice barely audible above the silence. The plush velvet booths were torn, the once gleaming mahogany bar scratched and marred. Even the air hung heavy with the scent of decay rather than the rich perfume of fine wine and expensive food he remembered. Evelyn placed a comforting hand on his arm. "The city changes, Julian, but some things, some feelings, they remain." Her voice was soft, understanding. She saw the raw pain etched onto his face, the desperate longing in his eyes. "But why?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "Why did it end like this? Why this place? This ruin?" He ran a trembling finger along the edge of the photograph, tracing Isabel's delicate features. The sharp tang of metallic dust filled his nostrils as he felt a tiny shard of glass embedded in the photo's surface. "We'll find out," Evelyn reassured him, her eyes firm. "We'll find out why someone wanted to erase your life, erase her from your life. This wasn't just about business, Julian. This was personal." She pointed to a small, almost invisible scratch on the wall near their booth. "See this? Looks like someone tried to remove something. A plaque, perhaps." Julian leaned closer, his breath misting on the cold, dusty surface. His fingers brushed against a faint, almost imperceptible indent. A flicker of something, a half-remembered image, a name, a cold, cruel smile flashed through his mind. He closed his eyes, clutching the photograph, a surge of nausea rolling over him. The fragments of memory, once elusive whispers, were becoming increasingly sharp, increasingly painful. He knew, with a growing certainty, that uncovering the truth wouldn't just heal his amnesia, but might shatter the fragile peace he'd begun to build. The past, it seemed, was far from over. The air in the opulent office hung thick with the scent of old money and simmering resentment. Julian, his face pale but resolute, stood across from Marcus Thorne, his business rival. Marcus, a man whose smile never quite reached his cold, calculating eyes, sat behind a massive mahogany desk, a single shaft of afternoon sun illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of an antique clock. "You know why I'm here, Marcus?" Julian said, his voice low and controlled, a stark contrast to the tremor in his hands. The faint scent of expensive cologne couldn't mask the underlying tension. Marcus leaned back, steepling his fingers. "I'm a successful businessman, Julian. Competition is fierce. A few setbacks are to be expected." His tone was smooth, devoid of remorse. "Setbacks?" Julian's voice tightened. "You orchestrated a car crash that left me with amnesia and nearly killed Isabel. You stole my life, my company, everything." Marcus chuckled, a dry, brittle sound. "Exaggeration, my dear Julian. Let's just say I expedited things. You were becoming inconvenient." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "Isabel was collateral damage, a necessary sacrifice." The words hit Julian like a physical blow. He felt the familiar surge of nausea, the phantom pain of the accident. The carefully constructed composure he'd worked so hard to maintain began to crumble. His eyes burned with unshed tears, his knuckles white as he clenched his fists. "You monster!" Julian choked out, the words laced with raw agony. He felt the weight of years of lost memories, of a love betrayed, a life stolen. The pain was visceral, a searing wound reopened. He wanted to lash out, to unleash the fury that had been suppressed for so long, but a chilling sense of dread held him back. Marcus still held cards close to his chest. He had to find proof, more than Marcus's chilling confession. He had to find Isabel. The raw fear gnawed at his resolve, a stark reminder of the vulnerability he'd carried, hidden beneath layers of success. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming his life, his love. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. The antique clock ticked, each second a hammer blow against Julian's fragile composure. He stared at Marcus, the polished mahogany desk a barrier between them, a chasm of betrayal. The scent of old leather and expensive cigars clung to the air, a suffocating reminder of the opulent cage Marcus had built around Julian's stolen life. Julian's knuckles, bone white against the dark wood of the desk, trembled. He felt the ghost of Isabel's hand in his, a phantom touch that both comforted and tore him apart. "Collateral damage," Marcus repeated, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. The casual cruelty of the phrase sliced deeper than any physical wound. It wasn't just a business rivalry. It was a personal vendetta fueled by envy and malice. Julian swallowed, the lump in his throat a physical manifestation of his grief. He had spent weeks piecing together his past, each fragmented memory a shard of glass cutting into his soul. Now the brutal truth lay bare, a wound that refused to heal. The images flashed before his eyes. Isabel's laughter, their shared dreams, the horrifying crash. "You think you won, Marcus?" Julian rasped, his voice thick with unshed tears. "But you don't know what you've lost. You took my memory, my life, but you'll never take my love for Isabel." The defiant words felt inadequate, fragile against the enormity of his loss. Marcus leaned forward, his eyes glittering with a predatory gleam. "Love? A sentimental fool. It's a weakness, Julian, something I discarded long ago. Power, however, that's enduring." He gestured dismissively toward the opulent surroundings. Julian felt a surge of anger, hot and furious, but he fought to control it, channeling it into a steely resolve. This wasn't about revenge. It was about justice, about reclaiming his life, and more importantly, finding Isabel. He reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing against the cool metal of a small, unmarked recording device. Whipping his hair across his face, a physical manifestation of his inner turmoil. Evelyn remained a few steps behind, her presence a quiet anchor in his turbulent sea of emotions. "It's different," Julian murmured, his voice barely audible above the wind's roar. He hadn't expected this hollow ache, this gaping emptiness where vibrant memories should reside. The cottage held the echoes of laughter, of shared dreams. But now, only a haunting silence answered his silent pleas. Evelyn approached, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "It's okay to feel lost, Julian. The past isn't easily reclaimed. It's like trying to piece together a shattered mirror. Some fragments will always be missing." He turned to her, his gaze searching, vulnerable. "But what if the missing pieces are the most important ones? What if the key to understanding Isabel, to understanding why, is gone forever?" The fear, sharp and raw, pierced the quiet desolation. Evelyn's eyes softened with empathy. "There are other pieces, Julian. The photographs, the letter, your own feelings. These fragmented memories, painful as they are still part of the puzzle. They show the depth of your love, the strength of your connection." He looked out at the sea again, the relentless waves mirroring the relentless tide of his grief. The scent of sea salt and brine filled his nostrils, a bittersweet reminder of shared sunsets, stolen kisses, whispered promises. "I remember the feeling," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "The feeling of her hand in mine, the warmth, but not the details. Not the face, not her laughter. A sigh escaped Evelyn's lips. The feeling is important, Julian. It's a testament to the bond you shared. And the details, they will come. Takes time. It takes patience. She paused, then added quietly, but finding Isabel, that might be faster than you think. Her words hung in the air, a spark of hope igniting in the darkness. The revelation, unspoken yet imminent, shifted the weight of their silent vigil, replacing despair with a fragile, hesitant anticipation. The worn leather of the antique chair creaked a mournful song under Julian's weight. The Cornish cottage, once a haven, now felt like a mausoleum. Dust motes danced in the slivers of sunlight piercing the gloom, each one a tiny, poignant reminder of time's relentless march. Evelyn sat opposite him, her expression a careful blend of concern and hope. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the rhythmic crash of waves against the shore. "I found something," Evelyn finally said, her voice soft, almost hesitant. She produced a small, tarnished silver locket from her bag. It was intricately carved, depicting intertwined Celtic knots. Julian stared at it, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. A strange warmth bloomed in his chest, a feeling so intense it stole his breath. He couldn't place it, couldn't name it, but it resonated with a profound familiarity. He reached out a trembling hand, his fingers tracing the cool metal. "It was hidden inside the lining of Isabel's favorite coat," Evelyn explained, watching him closely. "I thought, perhaps it might trigger something." He opened the locket. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a tiny, dried forget-me-not. The scent, faint but unmistakable, flooded his senses. It wasn't just a smell. It was a memory, a phantom touch on his skin, a ghost of a smile, a stolen kiss in a moonlit garden. Tears welled in his eyes, hot and stinging. "Forget-me-nots," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. She loved them. The words were a fragile bridge across the chasm of his amnesia, a tenuous connection to a life he couldn't fully grasp. Evelyn nodded gently, her own eyes glistening. "And she clearly wanted you to remember." The small, delicate flower became a powerful symbol, bridging the gap between the lost past and the uncertain future. The weight of unspoken words hung heavy in the air, a shared understanding of the profound and delicate journey ahead. The revelation of the locket, a small and seemingly insignificant object, had sparked a wildfire of emotion, igniting a flicker of hope in the desolate landscape of Julian's memory. The path to Isabel, to healing, seemed less daunting, less impossibly far. The faded photograph, a snapshot of laughter on a sun-drenched beach, felt like a shard of glass in Julian's chest. The salty tang of the sea air, a phantom scent conjured by the image, brought a fresh wave of grief. He stared at Isabel's radiant smile, a stark contrast to the emptiness gnawing at his soul. "She's alive," Evelyn's voice, quiet but firm, sliced through the silence. The words hung in the air, fragile as a butterfly's wing. Julian looked up, his eyes brimming with unshed tears. The news was both a stunning revelation and a terrifying prospect. He'd spent weeks piecing together fragments of a life he barely remembered, grappling with the betrayal, the loss, the agonizing void where his love for Isabel had been. Now, the possibility of her return, of facing the reality of their separation, felt almost unbearable. How is this possible?" he finally managed, his voice a hoarse whisper. The weight of years of forgotten pain pressed down on him. Evelyn sat beside him, her hand resting gently on his arm. "A former associate, a woman named Clara, contacted me. She'd kept track of Isabel, protecting her. She feared your rival, the one who orchestrated everything, would try to finish what he started." The fear in Evelyn's voice was palpable, mirrored in the tremor of Julian's hand. He closed his eyes, the beach scene still burning behind his eyelids. The joy, the relief threatening to overwhelm him, warred with the deep-seated fear. Finding Isabel was a victory, but it also meant facing the darkness that had torn their lives apart. He opened his eyes, a renewed determination hardening his gaze. "Tell me everything," he said, his voice stronger now, laced with a steely resolve. The path to Isabel was fraught with danger, but he would walk it. He had to. The faint scent of forget-me-nots, a whisper from the past, fueled his unwavering resolve. The locket, a symbol of their enduring love, pulsed with a silent promise. He would find her, and together they would face whatever lay ahead. The sterile white of Evelyn's office felt a stark contrast to the sun-drenched beach in Julian's memory. He ran a hand through his hair, the faint scent of antiseptic clinging to his skin, a bitter reminder of his journey. "So," he began, his voice rough, "we find her, and then what? Does she even want to see me?" Evelyn met his gaze, her expression a blend of empathy and cautious optimism. "Isabel's life has been spent looking over her shoulder, Julian. She's built a new life, a new identity. We need a plan, a delicate approach. Rushing in could shatter everything." The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on her shoulders. The afternoon light slanted through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Julian stared at them, each tiny particle a microcosm of the uncertainty swirling within him. "I understand the risks," he murmured. "But the thought of losing her again, it's unbearable." The pain in his voice was a palpable thing, heavy in the silence that followed. Evelyn leaned forward, her voice soft yet firm. "We'll proceed slowly, cautiously. Clara will act as an intermediary. She'll gauge Isabel's feelings, prepare her for a possible meeting. We need to ensure it's what she wants, a reunion on her terms." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "This isn't about reclaiming the past, Julian. It's about building a future together if she chooses." He nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling upon him. The fear remained, a cold knot in his stomach, but it was tempered by a fragile hope, a tentative bloom pushing through the barren landscape of his amnesia. The thought of seeing Isabel, of hearing her voice, of feeling her hand in his, it was both terrifying and intoxicating. He stood, the chair scraping against the polished floor, a jarring sound in the quiet room. "Let's start," he said, his voice stronger now, a resolute tremor in its quiet strength. The time for passive waiting was over. He was ready to face whatever the future held, ready to fight for his lost love, ready to face the truth, whatever form it took. The journey ahead remained fraught with danger, but for the first time since awakening, hope outweighed his fear. The drive to the secluded coastal cottage felt interminable. Salt spray misted the car windows, blurring the already indistinct landscape. Inside, Julian's knuckles were white, gripping the worn leather of the steering wheel. The cottage, a faded postcard in his memories, loomed ahead, a stark white against the bruised purple of the gathering storm. He glanced at Evelyn, her profile etched with concern in the fading light. "Are you sure about this, Evelyn?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper above the wind's mournful howl. Evelyn's hand rested briefly on his. "We're closer now, Julian. This place holds answers. But remember, we proceed with caution." Her words were a balm, yet the apprehension in her eyes mirrored his own. The cottage was silent, save for the rhythmic creak of the aging wood and the relentless drumming of rain against the roof. Dust motes danced in the weak light filtering through grimy windows. The air hung heavy with the scent of sea salt and decay, a poignant reminder of time's relentless passage. Julian felt a tremor of unease, a deep-seated fear he couldn't quite name. He moved through the rooms, each step a hesitant exploration of a forgotten life. A chipped teacup lay on a table, beside a faded photograph of Isabel, her laughter captured in a timeless smile. He picked it up, his fingers tracing the delicate rim, a wave of profound sadness washing over him. The memories, still fragmented, were sharper here, more vivid, more agonizingly incomplete. He saw glimpses of Isabel, her face illuminated by candlelight, her eyes filled with a love he'd almost forgotten, a love that had been brutally stolen. Evelyn joined him, her presence a silent comfort. "This was a haven," she murmured, her voice low and reverent, "a sanctuary from the storm brewing outside, and the one that was brewing within your life. She pointed to a small, wooden chest tucked away in a corner. Perhaps this holds some answers. It was locked, but a simple combination revealed its contents. A collection of Isabel's journals, their pages yellowed with age, filled with a handwriting both elegant and fiercely personal. He opened the first one, his breath catching in his throat. Isabel's words poured out, a torrent of love, fear, and unwavering devotion. A love letter stretching across years, a silent testament to a love that had defied even oblivion itself. The storm outside raged, mirroring the tempest brewing within him. The search for Isabel, once a tentative hope, had become a desperate need, a primal urge to reclaim what had been so cruelly taken from him. The weight of this realization left him breathless. The scent of old paper and dust clung to the air, a tangible reminder of the years that had passed. Julian traced Isabel's elegant script, each word a painful stab of recognition, a whispered echo of a life he'd almost entirely lost. Tears welled, blurring the ink. He read of stolen moments, whispered promises, and the chilling escalation of a threat that had shadowed their love. Evelyn watched him, her heart aching for his pain. The flickering candlelight cast long shadows across the room, turning the familiar cottage into a haunted space. "It's intense," Julian finally breathed, his voice thick with emotion. He closed the journal, the weight of Isabel's unspoken fears settling heavily on his chest. A fierce protectiveness, a burning desire to understand, consumed him. "It explains the secrecy, the disappearance," Evelyn offered softly, her gaze lingering on the fragile figure hunched over the journal. "Isabel was protecting you, Julian. Even in oblivion, her love endures." He nodded, the single movement speaking volumes of unspoken grief and newfound understanding. A wave of nausea washed over him, a visceral reminder of the trauma he was only beginning to unpack. He leaned heavily against the aged wooden table, the chipped teacup a cold comfort beneath his hand. The storm outside mirrored the turbulence within him. He looked at Evelyn, his eyes filled with a desperate hope. "What now?" His voice was raw, depleted by the emotional onslaught. The question hung in the air, heavy with the weight of unspoken fears and the fragile promise of a future he wasn't sure he could grasp. He was ready to find Isabel, but the fear of failure, the terror of discovering a truth too painful to bear, threatened to overwhelm him. The journey ahead was uncertain, fraught with peril, but the love he had rediscovered was a beacon guiding him through the darkness. The cottage, once a haven, now felt like a mausoleum. Rain lashed against the windows, mirroring the storm raging within Julian. He sat hunched, the faded photograph of a laughing Isabel clutched in his hand, its edges softened by time and tears. The scent of sea salt and wood smoke, once comforting, now felt sharp, a painful reminder of a stolen paradise. "She protected me," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind's howl. The words felt both liberating and crushing. The weight of her sacrifice pressed down on him, a suffocating blanket of guilt. Evelyn sat beside him, her hand resting gently on his arm. The silence between them was thick with unspoken emotions, a shared understanding born of shared grief. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows that seemed to mock their despair. "She loved you fiercely, Julian," Evelyn said softly, her voice a calming balm against the tempest in his soul. "That love, that strength, it's what kept her going, even through the darkness." He looked at her, his eyes red-rimmed, reflecting the flickering flames. "But at what cost? She disappeared, vanished, for me." The unspoken question hung in the air. Was his life worth the sacrifice she had made? The weight of that question threatened to pull him under. Evelyn squeezed his hand. "We will find her, Julian. We will bring her back." Her tone was resolute, a promise whispered against the storm's fury. It was a promise that felt both fragile and powerful. A slow nod was all he could manage, his throat choked with emotion. The fear was still there, a cold knot in his stomach, but it was overshadowed by a newfound determination. The love he'd rediscovered wasn't just a flicker of memory. It was a blazing fire, capable of burning away the darkness. He would not fail Isabel. He wouldn't let her sacrifice be in vain. He would find her, and then, together, they would face whatever lay ahead. The hunt for Isabel was no longer a desperate search for a lost love. It was a sacred mission, fueled by love, grief, and a fierce, protective rage. The storm outside raged on, but within the cottage, a fragile hope began to take root. The old Victorian mansion stood silhouetted against the bruised twilight sky, its darkened windows like vacant eyes. Inside, a flickering gas lamp cast long shadows as Julian and Evelyn approached Isabel's secluded apartment. The air hung heavy with anticipation, thick with the scent of old books and forgotten things. Julian's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the oppressive silence. "Ready?" Evelyn asked softly, her hand briefly resting on his arm. Her touch, a familiar comfort, steadied his trembling. He swallowed, the lump in his throat making speech difficult. "As I'll ever be," he whispered, his voice raspy with emotion. The apartment was sparsely furnished, yet imbued with a sense of quiet dignity. A single photograph of a younger, smiling Isabel sat on a worn oak table, its colors faded, yet her radiance somehow enduring. A faint melody, a melancholic piano piece, drifted from a gramophone in the corner. It was a tune he knew, a piece they had often listened to together. The memory, fragile and fleeting, sparked a wave of bittersweet nostalgia. A soft cough broke the silence. Isabel stood in the doorway, framed by the warm glow of the hallway lamp. She looked different, older, bearing the marks of time and hardship. Yet, her eyes, those incredible, captivating eyes, were the same. They held a familiar spark, a depth of understanding that transcended the years of separation. The air crackled with unspoken emotions. Julian's breath hitched. He wanted to rush to her, to hold her, to erase the years that had stolen their happiness. But he paused, aware of the fragility of this moment, the emotional minefield they stood poised to navigate. Isabel's voice was soft, hesitant. "Julian." The question hung in the air, a tentative bridge across a chasm of lost time. Her voice held a tremor, a mixture of hope and fear. He took a step towards her, each movement feeling monumental. "Isabel," he said, his voice thick with emotion. The word itself was a confession, a validation of a love that had endured the ravages of time and trauma. He saw a tear trace a path down her cheek, and he understood. This reunion, long awaited and desperately desired, was also fraught with the painful memories of their shared past. The journey ahead would be long and arduous, but in that shared glance, in that single whispered word, a new beginning had finally started to take shape. The air crackled with unspoken emotions. Isabel's eyes, once bright with laughter, now held a haunting depth, reflecting years of unspoken grief. The scent of lilies, her favorite, hung faintly in the air, a poignant reminder of happier times. Julian felt a wave of dizziness, the years of amnesia a swirling vortex threatening to pull him under. He reached out, his hand trembling, his touch hesitant. Isabel flinched, a barely perceptible movement, a physical manifestation of the emotional gulf between them. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the ticking of an antique grandfather clock in the hall. I don't know what to say," Julian finally managed, his voice rough with emotion. The words felt inadequate, a pathetic attempt to bridge the chasm of lost years. Isabel's lips trembled. "Neither do I," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Tears welled in her eyes, reflecting the gaslight's flickering glow. She reached out, her fingers brushing his, a tentative connection after years of separation. A wave of overwhelming emotion washed over Julian. The years of emotional detachment crumbled, replaced by a raw, aching vulnerability. He wanted to tell her everything, to pour out the torrent of emotions that had been bottled up for so long, but the words wouldn't come. He pulled her gently into his arms, the embrace tentative at first, then deepening, becoming a haven from the storm raging within. Isabel's body was rigid at first, guarded, Then she relaxed, her tears soaking his shirt. The faint scent of her perfume, a blend of roses and vanilla, filled his senses, a comforting echo of their past. The embrace spoke volumes, unspoken apologies, unsaid longings, a desperate yearning for connection. It was a silent acknowledgement of the shared trauma, the years stolen, the love that had somehow persevered. As they held each other, a silent promise was made, to rebuild, to heal, to face the future together, stronger than ever. The past could not be erased, but it could be acknowledged, understood, and, eventually, forgiven. The journey had just begun. The reunion wasn't the fairy tale reunion Julian had envisioned. The hushed elegance of the private room in the exclusive hotel felt suffocating, the scent of expensive lilies ironically clashing with the raw emotion hanging in the air. Isabel, her face etched with a weariness that mirrored his own, sat stiffly across from him, a fragile porcelain doll on the verge of shattering. The years had left their mark. The vibrant laughter in the old photographs was replaced by a cautious reserve. "Isabel," he began, his voice a hesitant whisper, the name tasting bittersweet on his tongue. He reached across the small table, his hand hovering over hers. She didn't flinch this time, but her stillness spoke volumes. "Julian," she replied, her voice barely a breath, a whisper lost in the opulent silence. Her eyes, the same shade of captivating green he remembered, filled with unshed tears. She studied his face, searching for something, recognition, perhaps, or maybe forgiveness. The weight of unspoken words pressed down on them. The years of separation, the trauma, the pain, it formed an invisible wall between them. Yet, a flicker of something akin to understanding passed between them. A shared glance, a silent acknowledgement of the long, arduous journey they had both endured. He saw a ghost of the woman he loved in her eyes, a hint of the radiant Isabel from the photographs. The years had stolen her youthful exuberance, leaving behind a quiet strength, a resilience forged in the crucible of adversity. He saw a reflection of his own hardened exterior in her guarded posture. They were both survivors, scarred but not broken. The clinking of ice in glasses, brought by a discreet waiter, broke the heavy silence. As the waiter left, a soft melody, a familiar piano piece from their past, drifted in from the nearby lounge. The music was a gentle touch, a delicate bridge across the chasm of lost time. Isabel's hand, still untouched, twitched slightly, as if drawn to his. The unspoken promise hung in the air, a fragile hope blooming amid the ruins of the past. The journey to rediscovering their love, their life, had truly begun. The melody, a melancholic waltz, seemed to fill the opulent silence, a poignant soundtrack to their tentative reunion. Isabel's hand, still untouched, trembled slightly. Julian reached across the small table, his fingers brushing hers. The contact sent a jolt through him, a spark igniting embers long banked. Her skin, cool beneath his, felt strangely familiar, yet distant. The years, etched deeply into her face, told a story of hardship. But in her eyes, a flicker of the radiant Isabel shone through the weariness. "It's you," she whispered, her voice husky with unshed tears, the words more a question than a statement. He nodded, throat tight with emotion. "It's me, Isabel. I remember now." The weight of those words, the years of lost memories, crashed down on him anew. The crystal glasses on the table seemed to shimmer, distorted by the welling tears blurring his vision. He saw a hint of a smile play on her lips, fragile, hesitant. "I knew," she breathed, her voice thick with emotion. "A part of me always knew you would." The years melted away, momentarily, replaced by the ghost of their shared laughter, their vibrant love. The waiter returned with a bottle of aged wine, the cork popping softly, a jarring intrusion into their private world. Julian poured 2 glasses, the ruby liquid reflecting the flickering candlelight. The aroma of ripe berries filled the air, a heady fragrance evoking a flood of bittersweet memories. He raised his glass. "To us," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Isabel's eyes met his. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. "To us?" she echoed, her voice barely audible, a poignant affirmation of a love that had endured, even through the darkest of times. The unspoken words hung heavy in the air, a testament to the shared trauma, the profound loss, but also to a resilience that refused to be extinguished. The journey of healing had begun, paved with the stones of remembrance and the fragile hope of a future together. The restaurant, Le Fleur de Sel, hummed with a low, sophisticated thrum. Candles flickered, casting dancing shadows on polished mahogany tables. Isabel, her face etched with the passage of time but her eyes still holding a spark of their youthful fire, sipped her wine, the ruby liquid catching the light. The silence between them crackled, thick with unspoken words and years of separation. The scent of sea salt and lilies, a perfume she'd always worn, tugged at Julian's memory, a bittersweet echo of a past almost entirely lost. "It's different," she finally said, her voice a low murmur that barely broke the quiet. She traced the rim of her glass with a slender finger, her gaze distant, lost in memories only she could fully grasp. Julian reached across the table, his hand hovering over hers. He knew the unspoken question hanging in the air. Could they truly bridge the chasm created by amnesia and years of deliberate separation? Could their love withstand the scars of the past? "Different, yes," he agreed, his voice rough, "but familiar, like coming home after a long, confusing journey." He finally took her hand, a tangible connection snapping across the years. Her skin felt cool, yet her touch sent a shiver of recognition down his spine, a silent language their hearts still understood. The waiter approached, interrupting their fragile intimacy. He refilled their glasses, the clink of crystal a jarring reminder of the present. Julian watched Isabel's hand tremble slightly as she lifted her glass. The wine, rich and full-bodied, offered a fleeting escape from the weight of their shared history. "To a new beginning," Julian offered, his voice filled with a mixture of hope and apprehension. His eyes, however, met hers directly, a silent promise of shared healing. Isabel smiled, a faint, hesitant curve of her lips. The years of pain softened, but not erased, in the corners of her eyes. "To a new beginning," she echoed, her gaze reflecting a mirrored sentiment, as fragile and beautiful as a blossoming flower. A shared glance, filled with unspoken understanding and nascent trust, sealed the promise. The future was uncertain, but together they would face whatever remained. The wine tasted sweet, a fitting symbol of the rediscovery of their enduring love. The opulent penthouse suite felt strangely cold despite the crackling fireplace. Isabel traced the rim of a crystal glass, the amber liquid swirling mirroring the turmoil within her. Years bled into each other, a hazy collage of fear and stolen moments. "It's surreal," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the city's muted hum. The cityscape, a glittering tapestry spread below, felt alien, a stark contrast to the quiet haven they'd once shared. Julian sat opposite, his gaze unwavering. He'd expected a joyous reunion, a rush of unadulterated relief. Instead, a cautious tenderness filled him. The memories, though slowly returning, still felt fragile, like shards of glass threatening to cut through the carefully constructed piece. He saw the wariness in her eyes, the same fear that had haunted his own fragmented recollections. "I know," he said, his voice husky, the weight of the past pressed down on them, a tangible force. He reached across the chasm of years, his fingers brushing hers. The contact sparked a jolt, a recognition so profound it stole his breath. It wasn't just a physical connection. It was a symphony of shared memories, of unspoken promises, of a love that had endured unimaginable trials. The silence stretched, filled only with the crackling fire and the distant city sounds. He saw the ghost of a smile touch her lips, a fleeting expression that hinted at a hope both fragile and fierce. "The restaurant, Le Fleur de Sel," she said, her voice gaining strength. "It's unchanged." The memory, sharp and clear, pierced the fog of her amnesia-induced past. the scent of sea salt and lilies, that same perfume she wore that night. Julian nodded, his heart aching with a bittersweet mixture of joy and regret. The shared memories, the fragments of a life almost lost, were slowly reassembling, piece by agonizing piece. He felt the strength of their bond, a silent pact forged in the crucible of trauma and loss. The fight wasn't over. Far from it. But together, hand in hand, they would face whatever remained. The future felt uncertain, yet the foundation was solid. The enduring power of a love that had survived oblivion. He knew with absolute certainty that they would rebuild, stronger and more resilient than before. The firelight danced in their eyes, reflecting the unwavering commitment that had outlasted years of silence and separation. The courtroom was stifling, a humid blanket clinging to Julian's skin. He sat beside Isabel, her hand, cool and surprisingly strong, nestled in his. The air thrummed with tension, a palpable energy that vibrated from the hushed whispers of the onlookers to the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. The rival, Mr. Hayes, sat across the room, his face a mask of controlled fury. This is all a lie. Hayes' voice, sharp and brittle, cracked the courtroom's silence. A manufactured drama to ruin my reputation. Isabel met his gaze, her eyes unwavering. The years of fear had etched lines around them, but her spirit remained unbroken. Your actions speak louder than your words, Mr. Hayes, she said, her voice clear and strong, a stark contrast to the tremor in her hands. The scent of her perfume, a familiar blend of lilies and sea salt, reminded Julian of their past, of the happiness they'd almost lost. Julian felt a surge of protectiveness, a familiar instinct ignited by the threat in Hayes' eyes. He leaned towards Isabel, offering a silent reassurance. The judge's gavel fell, a sharp crack that cut through the charged atmosphere. The trial was proceeding, the weight of their past and the threat of the future heavy in the air. The evidence, meticulously gathered by Evelyn, began to unravel Hayes' web of deceit, a slow, deliberate exposure of his years of manipulation and malice. Each piece of evidence, financial records, intercepted communications, even witness testimonies, chipped away at Hayes' composure, revealing the depth of his treachery. With each revelation, a wave of relief washed over Julian, mingled with the bitter taste of justice delayed. He watched Isabel, noting the subtle shift in her posture, the way her shoulders relaxed fractionally with each blow against Hayes' carefully constructed facade. The fear was still there, but now it was tinged with a growing sense of triumph. The past, though painful, was being acknowledged. Their wounds were finally beginning to heal. The courtroom, once a symbol of their oppression, was slowly transforming into a space of reclamation. As the trial neared its conclusion, Julian knew that the road to complete recovery was far from over. But for the first time in years, he and Isabel stood side by side, facing their future together, not as victims, but as survivors. The courtroom's hushed atmosphere felt stifling. Sunlight, fractured by the stained glass window, cast long shadows across the polished wood. Isabel's hand, cool and surprisingly firm in Julian's, offered a grounding presence amidst the swirling anxiety. Hayes, his face a mask of simmering rage, glared across the room, his breath hitching in ragged gasps. "This is a fabrication," he barked, his voice echoing in the tense silence. "A conspiracy." Isabel's gaze met his, unflinching. The years hadn't softened the steel in her eyes, only deepened their intensity. "Your actions, Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hand, "speak far louder than your words." The scent of lilies and sea salt, her perfume, hung in the air, a poignant reminder of their stolen years. Julian squeezed Isabel's hand, a silent promise of support. He felt a familiar surge of protectiveness, the instinct honed by years of shared trauma. The judge's gavel fell, a sharp crack that sliced through the suffocating tension. The trial, a slow, agonizing process, was finally moving forward. Evelyn's meticulous work began to unravel Hayes' web of lies, each piece of evidence a hammer blow against his carefully constructed facade. Financial records, intercepted communications, witness testimonies, the truth, irrefutable and devastating, emerged piece by piece. With each revelation, a wave of relief washed over Julian, bittersweet and tinged with the lingering bitterness of justice delayed. He watched Isabel, the subtle shift in her posture, the gradual relaxing of her shoulders, evidence of the weight slowly lifting from her. The fear hadn't vanished, but it was now interwoven with a burgeoning sense of triumph. The courtroom, once a symbol of their oppression, was slowly transforming into a space of reclamation, a place where their past was being acknowledged, where their wounds were finally beginning to heal. The long road to recovery still lay ahead, but for the first time in years, they stood together, not as victims, but as survivors, their shared gaze fixed on a future reclaimed. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of fiery orange and soft lavender. From his penthouse, Julian watched, a glass of amber liquid warming his hand. The city lights twinkled below, a glittering tapestry woven with memories both sharp and hazy. He thought of Isabel, her laughter echoing in the quiet spaces of his heart, a sound that had once been buried under layers of trauma. He took a slow sip, the smooth liquid a stark contrast to the turbulent emotions still churning within him. Thinking about her again? Evelyn's voice, soft as the evening breeze, startled him. She stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the fading light. Her smile was gentle, understanding. He nodded, unable to find words. The weight of the past, the years of silence, pressed down on him. "It feels surreal," he finally managed, his voice husky, "like a dream, but one I can't quite shake." Evelyn approached, her presence calming. "The healing process isn't linear, Julian. There will be moments of clarity, moments of confusion. It's all part of it." He turned, meeting her gaze. "But the guilt, the anger, I still feel them." He gestured towards the sprawling cityscape. "I could have done more. I should have." His voice trailed off, the unspoken words hanging heavy between them. Evelyn placed a comforting hand on his arm. "You were a victim, Julian. You were robbed of your memories, your life. But you're reclaiming it, piece by piece." She paused, her eyes filled with compassion. "And you're not alone." He looked at her, truly seeing her, the woman who had guided him through the darkest hours. A wave of gratitude washed over him, a profound appreciation for her unwavering support. "Thank you, Evelyn," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. The city lights seemed to shimmer with renewed hope, reflecting the dawning of a new chapter in his life, one built on forgiveness, understanding, and the enduring strength of love rediscovered. The fight wasn't over, but the path forward, though still daunting, felt less lonely now. The crisp morning air bit at Julian's cheeks as he and Isabel walked along the beach, the sand cool beneath their bare feet. The ocean roared a symphony of crashing waves, a stark contrast to the quiet intensity between them. Years melted away, replaced by a tentative understanding, a fragile peace forged in the crucible of trauma. He reached for her hand, his touch hesitant. Isabel's fingers intertwined with his, a silent promise whispered between them. "It's different," Isabel said, her voice barely a breath, the salt spray misting her face. Her eyes, once bright with laughter, now held a shadow of the past, a lingering sadness. Julian squeezed her hand, feeling the tremors in her grip. "Different, yes, but better?" he offered, the question hanging between them like a fragile kite in a strong wind. She nodded slowly, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. "Better," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "but scarred." She gestured to the faint line on her arm, a barely visible reminder of the attack. The sun warmed their faces, but the chill of the past still lingered. They walked in silence for a while, the rhythmic crash of the waves a constant backdrop to their unspoken emotions. The weight of their shared trauma hung heavy, a silent companion to their rekindled love. The threat of their nemesis remained a chilling undercurrent, a shadow lurking just beyond the sun's warmth. The scent of salt and seaweed mingled with the faint aroma of wood smoke, a reminder of the seaside cottage where their love story had begun. Memories flickered, sun-drenched afternoons, stolen kisses, whispered promises under a star-studded sky. Those memories were interwoven with the pain of loss, the years of separation, the near destruction of their lives. But now, hand in hand, they faced a future filled with the hope of rebuilding, of reclaiming their love, scarred as it was. The fight wasn't over, but they were finally fighting together. The ocean stretched before them, vast and unforgiving, yet also full of promise, a metaphor for their uncertain but hopeful future. The courtroom was stifling, a thick blanket of anticipation hanging heavy in the air. Julian, his hand clasped tightly in Isabel's, felt the familiar tremor return. The lawyer's voice, a monotonous drone, recounted the evidence, a stark reminder of the nightmare they'd barely escaped. The scent of old wood and polished mahogany fought with the metallic tang of fear clinging to the air. Isabel's eyes, usually sparkling with life, were clouded with a weariness that mirrored his own. The defendant, Mr. Silas Thorne, the lawyer continued, his voice amplified by the microphone, demonstrated a clear pattern of harassment, intimidation, and ultimately, attempted murder. Julian felt a surge of anger, a cold fire in his belly, but he suppressed it, focusing on Isabel's hand. He squeezed it gently. Later, outside the courthouse, the city's cacophony washed over them, a chaotic blend of car horns, chattering voices, and the distant wail of a siren. Yet, within their shared silence, a new kind of peace settled. The victory felt hollow, a bandage on a deep wound. Justice had been served, but the scars remained. "It's over," Isabel whispered, her voice catching. She leaned against him, the warmth of her body a comforting anchor in the swirling storm of emotions. The sunlight, filtering through the towering buildings, cast long shadows, highlighting the fragility of their newly found peace. "Not over," Julian corrected softly, his voice husky with emotion. "But a beginning." He traced the faint line of a scar on her arm, a pale testament to the violence they'd endured. "We still have to heal." The city blurred around them, the noise fading into a muted hum. They walked hand in hand, the unspoken understanding between them a silent promise, a vow to face the future together, stronger, scarred, but undeniably whole. The weight of the past was still present, but it no longer defined them. It was now a part of their shared narrative, a testament to their resilience, their love, a love that had survived the storms and emerged, changed, but stronger, into the light. The crisp autumn air nipped at their cheeks as Julian and Isabel walked through Central Park, the fallen leaves crunching underfoot. A symphony of rustling leaves and distant laughter filled the air, a stark contrast to the sterile silence of the courtroom. Isabel shivered, pulling her coat tighter. "It's colder than I remember," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Julian slipped his arm around her, the warmth of his touch a comforting balm. "We'll find somewhere warm," he promised, his gaze softening with concern. The city lights twinkled in the distance, a glittering tapestry against the darkening sky. The past few weeks had been a blur of intense emotions, relief, anger, fear, and the overwhelming joy of their reunion. But the shadow of Silas Thorne still loomed, a constant reminder of the fragile peace they had achieved. They found refuge in a small, cozy cafe, the aroma of roasted coffee beans and warm pastries filling the air. The gentle hum of conversation created a sense of normalcy, a welcome respite from the storm of their recent ordeal. As they sipped their coffees, a comfortable silence settled between them, punctuated only by the clinking of cups and the soft murmur of the barista. I still can't believe it's really over," Isabel confessed, her eyes welling up. The fear, deeply ingrained in her, still clung to her like a second skin. Julian reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "It is," he reassured her, his voice firm but gentle. "We won. We're together. And we'll face whatever comes next, together." His words were a promise, a vow whispered between two souls bound by a love that had endured unimaginable trials. He squeezed her hand, the the silent communication conveying a depth of emotion words could not capture. The warmth of his touch, the quiet strength in his eyes, helped to calm her fears. The future remained uncertain, but for now, surrounded by the comforting normalcy of the cafe, they could simply be together. The journey had been arduous, but as they looked into each other's eyes, the promise of a new beginning shone bright, a beacon illuminating their path. The following weeks were a blur of legal paperwork, therapy sessions, and stolen moments. Julian's penthouse, once a symbol of cold, isolated success, now hummed with a quiet warmth.